The encounter. Isabella Duncan strode confidently into the first-class cabin, her designer heels clicking crisply against the plush carpet. Her tailored suit and sleek hairstyle radiated professionalism, but behind her polished exterior was a bubbling frustration that had been building all day. The meetings she had attended felt pointless, the business lunches were draining, and the phone calls seemed endless. All she wanted was to sink into the comfort of her first-class seat, sip a glass of fine wine, and enjoy the silence that air travel provided. As she approached her seat, 2A, her eyes landed on the man already seated beside her in 2B. He was casually dressed in jeans, a simple t-shirt, and a hoodie, looking utterly out of place in the luxurious surroundings of first class. He had headphones on, his head slightly bobbing to some rhythm only he could hear, completely oblivious to the world around him. A flash of annoyance crossed Isabella's face. Who let this man in here? She wondered. Her thoughts raced. First class was supposed to be exclusive, a retreat for high-paying passengers like her. She wasn't used to sharing this space with someone who, in her mind, didn't belong. She paused for a moment, debating whether to even sit down, as the man looked completely at ease. His presence irritated her for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, but the discomfort she felt was undeniable. Taking a deep breath, Isabella sat down stiffly, her body tense with annoyance. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her assistant, complaining about the situation. The attendant hadn't even offered her a drink yet, and the man next to her was humming under his breath as he scribbled something on a notepad. "Excuse me," she muttered, waving over the nearest flight attendant, a petite woman with bright red lipstick and a forced smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I assist you?" the flight attendant asked, bending slightly to meet Isabella's piercing gaze. Isabella lowered her voice, though there was no hiding the irritation. "I need to be moved. I don't feel comfortable sitting here." The flight attendant blinked, her smile faltering just slightly as she glanced around the full first-class cabin. "I'm so sorry, ma'am, but we're fully booked. There are no available seats left." Fully booked. Isabella's tone sharpened. "I'm not paying this kind of money to sit next to." Her voice trailed off, her eyes flicking toward the man beside her, who was now tapping something into his laptop. "Is there really no alternative?" The attendant's posture stiffened as she looked at the man beside Isabella. The realization seemed to hit her. "Ma'am, I truly wish there were more seats available, but unfortunately, everyone has already boarded, and all the seats in first class are occupied. I can assure you that we'll do everything we can to make your flight as comfortable as possible." "Comfortable?" Isabella snapped. "This is hardly what I call comfortable." The flight attendant stood there awkwardly for a moment before retreating to tend to another passenger. Isabella huffed, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She looked over at the man again, noticing the calmness in his demeanor, the way he seemed completely unaware of the disruption he was causing her. As the flight prepared for takeoff, Isabella's mind raced. She couldn't let it go. She deserved better than this. A woman like her, with her status and wealth, shouldn't have to tolerate such discomfort. She leaned back in her seat, biting her lip as she considered her options. Maybe she could escalate the complaint, speak to someone higher up once they landed. Beside her, the man closed his laptop and adjusted his seat, settling in as the plane began to taxi down the runway. He glanced over at her, offering a small smile, which only fueled her irritation further. She turned away, unwilling to engage. The plane lifted into the air, and the quiet hum of flight filled the cabin. For a moment, Isabella considered plugging in her headphones, burying herself in work, and ignoring everything around her. But something about the man beside her kept gnawing at her. She glanced at him again, this time noticing the way he carried himself, his posture, his confidence, the way he seemed entirely at peace in the space that, in her mind, he didn't belong in. After an hour, the seatbelt sign clicked off, and the flight attendants began their service. The man reached into his bag and pulled out a thick leather folder, filled with documents. Isabella watched as he methodically sorted through them, occasionally jotting notes down or highlighting sections. Curious despite herself, she tried to glance at the papers, but the angle wasn't right. It looked official, though, maybe legal documents or contracts. Just as she was about to settle back, the man glanced over at her and caught her eye. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, but with a deep undertone of authority that made her sit up straighter. Isabella blinked, caught off guard. "I'm fine," she said quickly, turning back toward her window. The man didn't press, returning to his work without another word, but Isabella's thoughts churned. She couldn't place it, but there was something about him that didn't add up. He was too calm, too composed for someone who, in her mind, should be out of his depth in first class. Who was he? And why did he feel so at home in a place that was supposed to be reserved for the elite? The question swirled in her mind, but for the moment, she had no answers. What she didn't realize was that her assumption about who this man was and what he was doing in first class was about to be completely upended. Hidden realities. As the plane continued its ascent, Isabella's mind wandered. She couldn't shake the nagging curiosity about the man beside her. Who was he really? It wasn't just his presence that unnerved her, but the ease with which he seemed to occupy the space. His calm demeanor, the documents, the effortless confidence, none of it aligned with the image she had initially constructed in her head. Her thoughts drifted to her own life. Isabella Duncan wasn't just another first-class passenger. She had spent years building her career from the ground up, rising through the ranks of a competitive finance industry. Her connections stretched across continents, and her reputation for closing deals was unmatched. People respected her, feared her even. And yet here she was, seated next to a man who had disrupted her perfectly crafted world with nothing more than his presence. It gnawed at her. She tried to distract herself, pulling out her own work, a sleek tablet filled with reports she had yet to review. She scrolled through the documents half-heartedly, but her mind kept drifting back to them. The man beside her remained engrossed in his work, occasionally glancing out the window or adjusting the stack of papers in front of him. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, serving drinks and small meals. Isabella declined, her appetite diminished by the discomfort she still felt. She glanced over at the man again, catching a glimpse of his name printed on one of the documents. It read, A. Jameson. 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 She ran the name through her mind, wondering if it rang any bells, but came up with nothing. He didn't seem like anyone she had heard of in her circles, and that only deepened her intrigue. As the attendants cleared the trays and the cabin settled into a quiet hum of soft conversations and the whirring of the plane, Isabella felt the need to know more. It wasn't just her ego driving her now. It was pure curiosity. Who was this man, and why was he here? Without turning to him, she casually spoke, her voice cool and measured. "I couldn't help but notice the documents you're working on. Must be important." The man looked up from his work, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if he had expected her to break the silence at some point. "Yeah, you could say that," he replied, his tone polite but guarded. Isabella waited for him to elaborate, but when he didn't, she pressed further. "Work or personal?" "A little of both," he said, carefully folding one of the papers and placing it into the folder. "What about you? Business or pleasure?" She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Business. Always business." He nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her answer. There was a pause, and for a moment, she thought the conversation was over. But then he spoke again, his voice still calm and unhurried. "It's interesting how much time we spend working. Sometimes I wonder what it's all for." Isabella blinked. The question, though casual, unsettled her. She had never really asked herself that. Her life had always been about moving forward, reaching the next goal, conquering the next obstacle. There was no room for reflection. "It's for success," she answered automatically, her tone matter-of-fact. "For achieving everything you've worked for. Isn't that why we all work?" The man smiled, a slow, thoughtful smile. I suppose it depends on how you define success. Isabella bristled slightly, feeling as though he was implying something she didn't quite understand. She glanced at him, and for the first time, really looked at him. He was younger than she had first thought, maybe mid-30s. His skin was dark, his features sharp yet relaxed. His eyes, however, were what struck her the most, calm but intense, as though he had seen more than most people could imagine. His presence was commanding, despite the casual clothes and unassuming demeanor. "Success is achieving what you set out to do," Isabella replied, almost defensively. "It's about reaching the top, about having the freedom to do what you want, when you want. Isn't that the goal for everyone?" He chuckled softly, leaning back in his seat as if pondering her words. That's one way to look at it. His nonchalance irritated her. Isabella wasn't used to people questioning her worldview, let alone a stranger who, from what she could tell, had no business being in the same cabin as her. She had earned her place in first class. Every long hour, every sleepless night, every sacrifice had gotten her here. But him, what had he done? "You seem awfully relaxed for someone who's obviously here for business," she said, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. The man turned his head toward her, meeting her gaze directly. His eyes were calm but piercing, and for a moment, Isabella felt as though he could see right through her. "I've learned that stress doesn't really help get the job done," he said simply. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the flight attendant reappeared, offering them both drinks. The man accepted a glass of sparkling water, but Isabella waved her off, too absorbed in her thoughts. The plane continued its journey, but Isabella's mind was whirling. She had never encountered someone so unfazed by her presence, someone who didn't seem intimidated or impressed by her status. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, her mind racing to make sense of it all. As the hours passed, the lights in the cabin dimmed, signaling the transition into the nighttime portion of the flight. Most passengers had begun to doze off or lose themselves in books or movies. Isabella glanced over again, watching as the man closed his folder and placed it in the seat pocket in front of him. He leaned back, his eyes closed, as if he had not a care in the world. Her curiosity was at its peak now. There was something she wasn't seeing, something he wasn't telling her. She needed to know more. Was he just some nobody with an inflated sense of self, or was there something deeper beneath the surface? Unable to contain herself any longer, she decided to break the silence again. "So what exactly do you do? You seem rather composed for someone on a business trip." He didn't open his eyes, but a small smile appeared on his face again. "I own a business. Several, actually." Isabella raised an eyebrow, her skepticism clear. "Oh, what kind of businesses?" The man finally opened his eyes and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Airlines." For a moment, Isabella's brain struggled to process the word. "Airlines." She blinked, replaying the word in her mind, certain she had misheard. But when his calm expression didn't change, the realization hit her like a ton of bricks. He wasn't just a random passenger. He wasn't just some guy who had lucked into a first-class seat. He owned the airline they were currently flying on. Her mouth went dry. The irritation she had felt earlier, the dismissive thoughts about his appearance, the assumptions she had made about him, all of it suddenly seemed so small, so ignorant in the face of who this man really was. Isabella turned away, staring blankly out the window, her mind reeling from the shock. She had judged him, written him off based on nothing more than appearance. And now she realized how profoundly wrong she had been. The unveiling. For several long minutes, Isabella sat frozen in her seat, her mind reeling from the revelation. He owns airlines. She replayed the man's words over and over, trying to grasp their full weight. How could she have missed it? How could she, a woman who prided herself on reading people so well, have been so completely blindsided? Her initial irritation morphed into a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Isabella had always been careful with her assumptions, but this time She had built an entire narrative about the man based on nothing but his casual attire and calm demeanor. And now she realized she couldn't have been more wrong. The man, A. Jameson, as she now knew, seemed unfazed by her stunned silence. He leaned back in his seat, his fingers casually drumming against the armrest, completely at ease as though he hadn't just dropped a bombshell. His calmness, once an irritant, now intrigued her. Who exactly was he? Isabella's world was one of power dynamics. Every interaction, every deal, every relationship in her life was built on understanding who had control and how much. She had always thought that in first class, the lines were clear. Wealth and success determined your place. Yet here was someone who shattered that belief effortlessly. The flight continued its quiet journey, but Isabella's mind refused to settle. She needed to know more about him, to understand how someone like him could fly so far under the radar. She cleared her throat, trying to collect herself before speaking again. "So," she said, keeping her voice casual but laced with curiosity, "you own airlines. Which ones, if you don't mind me asking?" The man turned to face her, his expression unreadable, but with a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Several," he said simply, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. "This one, for starters." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This one. Her mind raced, trying to recall every detail of the airline they were on. It was one of the largest carriers in the world, known for its high-end service and exclusive routes. And he owned it. She leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now, curiosity completely taking over. How? How did that happen? I mean, that's not exactly something you hear every day." A. Jameson smiled again, but this time there was something deeper in his expression, something that hinted at stories far beyond what he had shared so far. "It's a long story," he said, his tone still calm. "But let's just say I've been in the business world for a long time. Airlines are just one piece of it." He glanced out the window, as though contemplating something far away. "I've always believed in seeing the bigger picture. Not just flying from point A to point B, but understanding how people move, how business connects. It's not just about the planes. It's about people, about creating experiences." Isabella listened intently, her initial skepticism dissolving into fascination. There was something compelling about the way he spoke, like every word carried the weight of experience, of someone who had seen the world from angles she had never imagined. "I started small," he continued, his voice still measured. "Grew up in a neighborhood where opportunities weren't exactly handed out, but I've always had this belief that if you see an opportunity, you grab it. No excuses, no waiting for the right time, because there's no such thing as the right time." Isabella felt a pang of discomfort. His words struck closer to home than she expected. She had always been driven, always reaching for the next rung on the ladder. But hearing it from him, someone who had clearly succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, made her question the road she was on. "How did you get started?" she asked, her voice softer now, more genuine. She wanted to understand him, to figure out how someone like him had risen so high when everything about him defied her expectations. He turned back to face her, his gaze steady. "You could say it started with a single plane," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I was young, just out of school, and I had this vision. I saw a need for affordable, quality air travel in markets that were underserved. It wasn't about competing with the big guys. It was about creating something people could rely on, something they could trust." Isabella nodded, captivated. "So you built it from the ground up?" "Piece by piece," he replied. "It wasn't easy. A lot of people didn't believe in me at first. Banks turned me down. Investors thought I was crazy. But I kept pushing. I found a few people who believed in the vision. And from there, things started to grow." He paused, his gaze softening as though recalling those early days. "It wasn't glamorous at first. I worked out of a tiny office, did everything myself. From marketing to maintenance to making sure the planes ran on time. I was involved in every single detail." Isabella sat back, absorbing his words. This man, who she had initially dismissed, had built an empire from scratch. His calm demeanor wasn't indifference. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered storms she couldn't even imagine. Her own success, she realized, had been different. She had come from privilege, born into a family with connections, with resources. She had worked hard, yes, but she had never faced the kind of obstacles that Jameson clearly had. And yet, here they were, sitting side by side in first class. There was a brief silence as the two sat, the hum of the plane filling the cabin. Isabella's thoughts swirled. She had spent so much time thinking. She understood how the world worked, how success was earned. But this man's story challenged everything she had believed. After a few moments, she spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "It's impressive," she admitted, "what you've done." Jameson nodded, but there was no arrogance in his expression, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Thanks, but I didn't do it alone. No one ever does. It's about building a team, trusting people, and knowing when to take risks." Isabella hesitated, the next question forming in her mind before she could stop it. Do you think it's all worth it? The work, the stress, the sacrifices." Jameson looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as though he understood exactly where the question was coming from. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said softly. "You spend so much time chasing success, but in the end, you have to ask yourself what it's really for." Isabella felt her throat tighten. It was a question she had avoided for a long time. She had always equated success with happiness, with reaching the top. But now, sitting next to someone who had reached heights she could only dream of, she wondered if there was something more. Jameson smiled slightly, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "It's not about the money," he said quietly. "It's never just about the money. It's about creating something that lasts, something that matters. The trick is finding balance, knowing when to push forward and when to step back." For the first time in a long time, Isabella felt something she rarely experienced: humility. Here was a man who had built an empire, yet he wasn't flaunting it. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He had succeeded, and yet he seemed more grounded, more at peace than anyone she had ever met. The cabin lights dimmed further, signaling that the flight was transitioning into its night phase. Most passengers were settling in for sleep, but Isabella remained wide awake, her mind racing with thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to confront in years. As Jameson leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, Isabella stared out the window, the dark sky stretching endlessly before them. She had come on this flight expecting nothing more than a few hours of peace before her next meeting. But instead, she had encountered someone who had shaken her to her core. And as the plane sailed through the night, she realized that this flight, this moment, was going to change everything. Shifting perspectives. The hum of the plane seemed to fade into the background as Isabella's thoughts deepened. She had always been so certain of herself, so sure of her path, her purpose. Yet in just a few hours, Jameson, a man she had initially dismissed without a second thought, had made her question everything she knew about success, power, and fulfillment. As the flight wore on, sleep was elusive for Isabella. She watched the cabin grow quieter, the lights dimming further as passengers around her began to drift into their own worlds of rest. But rest was far from her mind. Her thoughts were too busy, too tangled up in the complex web of her life. For the first time in years, she wasn't thinking about the next deal, the next goal, or the next step in her career. Instead, she found herself revisiting moments from her past, moments she had long buried beneath layers of ambition. She thought of her childhood, growing up in a family that valued success above all else. Her father, a well-known corporate lawyer, had always made it clear that only the best was acceptable. Mediocrity, in his eyes, was failure. Isabella had carried that mindset with her through every stage of her life, through school, where she had been at the top of her class, through her early career, where she had outpaced her peers, and now in her current role as a high-powered executive. But as she sat there, Next to a man who had redefined success in a way she had never considered, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her choices. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to wonder if she was truly happy. The thought unsettled her. Happiness had always been an afterthought for her, a byproduct of success, not a goal in itself. She had always believed that if she worked hard enough, earned enough, and achieved enough, happiness would naturally follow. But now, as she listened to the steady breathing of the man beside her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. She glanced at Jameson again, this time with a new sense of curiosity. What had driven him? What had kept him going when the world had told him no, when the banks had refused him loans, and when investors had called him crazy? And more importantly, how had he found peace in a world that seemed to offer anything but? Unable to resist her growing curiosity, Isabella leaned slightly toward him. "You said earlier that it's not about the money," she began quietly, careful not to disturb the other passengers. "But what is it about then? What drives you?" Jameson opened his eyes slowly, turning his head to face her. His expression was thoughtful, as though he had been expecting this question all along. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if he was considering how much to share. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with a weight that made Isabella listen intently. "It's about legacy," he said simply. "It's about leaving something behind that matters. I didn't grow up with much, didn't have the opportunities that people like you probably had. But I knew from a young age that I wanted to create something bigger than myself, something that would outlive me." Isabella's brow furrowed slightly. Legacy. It was a concept she had heard before, but never really thought about in the way he was describing it. "Legacy? You mean like money, a family name?" Jameson smiled faintly and shook his head. "No, not money. Not even my name. Really, it's about the impact you leave on the world. The people you help. The lives you change. The communities you build. When I started my airline, I wasn't just thinking about profits or market share. I was thinking about the people who would benefit from having access to affordable, reliable travel. I was thinking about the jobs I could create, the families I could support, the dreams I could help people chase. That's what drives me." Isabella sat back, digesting his words. She had spent her entire life focused on herself, on her own success, her own goals. She had never considered the broader impact of her work, never thought about how her success might affect others. The idea of leaving behind something meaningful, something that wasn't tied to wealth or status, was foreign to her. And yet, as Jameson spoke, she found herself drawn to the idea. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked after a pause. "All the sacrifices you had to make, the time you spent building your business. Don't you ever wonder if you missed out on other things?" Jameson looked at her for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful. "Of course," he said quietly. "There are always sacrifices. You can't build something great without giving up something in return. But I've always tried to keep things in perspective. Yes, I worked hard, and yes, I missed out on some things along the way. But I also made sure to prioritize what really mattered: my family, my friends, the people who supported me. At the end of the day, success doesn't mean much if you're standing alone." Isabella felt a lump form in her throat. She had always been so focused on her career that she had neglected everything else. Her family. She barely spoke to them, too busy with work to maintain those relationships. Her friends. They were more like colleagues. People she networked with, not people she confided in. And as for love, well, that had always been pushed aside in favor of the next promotion, the next big project. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the weight of her own choices pressing down on her. She had spent so much time climbing the corporate ladder that she hadn't realized how lonely it was at the top. Jameson seemed to sense her discomfort, and his expression softened. "It's never too late, you know," he said gently. "To change things, to find balance. It's easy to get caught up in the chase for success, but at the end of the day, we're all just trying to find meaning in what we do. The question is, What kind of meaning are you looking for? Isabella didn't know how to respond. She had spent so long chasing something she wasn't even sure she wanted anymore. For years, she had told herself that success meant power, money, and prestige. But sitting here next to a man who had achieved all of those things and still spoke about legacy, about impact, she realized how hollow her definition of success really was. The flight attendant passed by again, offering coffee and tea to the few passengers still awake. Isabella accepted a cup of black coffee, hoping it would clear her head. She needed time to process everything Jameson had said, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation was exactly what she needed. After a few moments of silence, she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. I spent my whole life thinking that success was the only thing that mattered. That as long as I worked hard enough, everything else would fall into place. But now, I'm not so sure. Jameson nodded, his eyes kind but knowing. It's easy to fall into that trap, he said softly. Especially in our world, where everything is about the next deal, the next big win. But the truth is, success is only one part of the puzzle. You have to figure out what really makes you happy, what gives your life meaning. And that's different for everyone. Isabella stared into her coffee, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and hope. She had always thought she knew what she wanted. But now, sitting here, she wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe it wasn't too late to change. Maybe she could find a different path, one that wasn't just about climbing to the top, but about building something meaningful along the way. I don't know if I'm ready to figure that out, she admitted quietly. Jameson smiled gently, his eyes warm with understanding. You don't have to figure it all out right now, he said. It's a process. It takes time. The important thing is that you're asking the right questions. The rest will come. Isabella nodded, feeling a small sense of relief wash over her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the pressure to have all the answers. Maybe it was okay to not know, to take her time and figure things out as she went. As the cabin settled into an even deeper quiet, Isabella leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing, but in a different way. She wasn't thinking about her next meeting or her next project. She was thinking about her life, about what she really wanted, about the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. And for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a path that wasn't just about success, but about something deeper, something more fulfilling. As she closed her eyes and let the soft hum of the plane lull her into a peaceful state, she knew that this conversation had changed something within her. And though she didn't know where this new path would lead, she was finally ready to take the first step. Crossroads of reflection. Hours had passed since the conversation with Jameson, yet Isabella couldn't shake the lingering effects of their exchange. She had slipped in and out of sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, her mind would return to the same questions. What kind of legacy was she leaving behind? What was the real meaning of success? The soft glow of the sunrise began to filter through the cabin, illuminating the quiet, sleeping faces of passengers scattered throughout first class. The plane was somewhere over the Atlantic now, and soon they would be landing. Normally, Isabella would be reviewing her schedule, preparing for the string of meetings that awaited her upon arrival. But this time, she couldn't muster the energy to care about the day ahead. The world she had worked so hard to build, the identity she had crafted over years of relentless pursuit, felt strangely distant now. She stared out the window, watching the horizon grow brighter with each passing moment. The rising sun reminded her that a new day was beginning, not just in the literal sense, but in a deeper, more personal way. She could feel it, the shift inside her. It was subtle, but undeniable. Something had changed. Jameson had fallen asleep beside her, his breathing even and peaceful. He seemed entirely at ease, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She marveled at his calm. How did he manage to stay so grounded, so centered? He had built empires, yet he wasn't weighed down by them. If anything, he seemed lighter than most people she knew. Isabella found herself envying that peace, wondering if she could ever attain it. She reached for her tablet, intending to distract herself with work, but paused. Instead of opening the email app as she usually did, she found herself scrolling through old photos, images from years ago that she rarely looked at anymore. Pictures of her family, friends, moments from her life before everything became about career and ambition. One photo caught her eye. It was from a family gathering, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. In the picture, Isabella stood next to her younger sister, Claudia, both of them laughing, their arms around each other's shoulders. Claudia's face was full of joy, and Isabella looked carefree in a way she hadn't been in years. That moment had felt so distant. Until now. Isabella's throat tightened as memories of her sister flooded her mind. They had been close once, inseparable even, but as Isabella's career took off, she had grown distant, consumed by the demands of her job. Claudia had tried to stay in touch, sending texts, calling, asking to meet up for coffee or lunch, but Isabella had always been too busy chasing success, too busy to realize what she was leaving behind. Claudia had eventually stopped trying. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Isabella closed her eyes, guilt washing over her. What had she been doing all these years? What had she sacrificed in her pursuit of success? Relationships, happiness, herself. She took a deep breath, the weight of her decisions settling heavily on her chest. For the first time, she could clearly see the cost of the choices she had made. Yes, she had money, power, and a title that commanded respect. But at what cost? Her thoughts drifted back to Jameson's words. Success doesn't mean much if you're standing alone. That line played over and over in her head, resonating with her more deeply now than it had during their conversation. She had built a life based on achievement, but somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what truly mattered. And now, at 36 years old, sitting in a first-class cabin with a man who had challenged everything she thought she knew about life, she realized that she was at a crossroads. There was still time to change, time to rebuild, time to reconnect with the people she had neglected, to find meaning beyond the walls of her office. But the question remained, did she have the courage to do it? The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting her out of her thoughts. Jameson stirred beside her, blinking awake as the plane shook slightly. He glanced at Isabella, sensing the weight of her thoughts, but said nothing, simply giving her a quiet nod of acknowledgement. Isabella wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words felt stuck in her throat. She had always been so guarded, so careful not to show weakness, but now, the walls she had built around herself seemed suffocating. For years, she had prided herself on being the strong, independent woman who needed no one. But what if she had been wrong? What if strength wasn't about shutting people out, but about letting them in? Taking a deep breath, she finally spoke, her voice soft, but laden with emotion. "I've been thinking about what you said, about legacy and success." Jameson turned toward her fully now, his eyes warm and attentive. "Yeah." Isabella nodded, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "I've spent my whole life chasing after something I thought I wanted. But now, I'm not so sure anymore. I thought success was about power, about reaching the top. But," she trailed off, unsure of how to finish the thought. Jameson waited, giving her the space to find her words. "But now I'm wondering if I've been going about it all wrong," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've sacrificed so much. I've pushed people away. I've lost touch with who I used to be." Jameson leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging. "It takes a lot of courage to admit that. Most people go their whole lives without ever realizing it." Isabella bit her lip, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know where to go from here," she admitted. "I feel like I've been running on this treadmill, chasing something I'm not even sure I want anymore. But I don't know how to stop." Jameson gave her a thoughtful look. "You don't have to stop," he said gently. "You just have to change direction. Success doesn't have to mean leaving everything else behind. You can still be ambitious, still chase your goals, but you don't have to do it alone. You can build a life that's full, not just of accomplishments, but of relationships, of purpose. You just have to decide what's most important to you. Isabella looked down at her hands, her mind racing. Could it really be that simple? Could she really change? Could she undo the years of single-minded focus and start over? I don't even know where to begin, she said quietly, almost to herself. Jameson smiled, his expression kind but knowing. You begin by taking one step, reaching out to the people you've lost touch with, reconnecting with what makes you happy. It's not going to happen overnight, but the fact that you're even thinking about it means you're already on the right path. Isabella nodded, the knot in her chest loosening just a little. She wasn't sure if she could fully embrace this new way of thinking, this idea of balance and purpose, but for the first time in years, she was willing to try. The plane began its descent, the announcement coming over the intercom that they would be landing soon. Isabella stared out the window as the city below came into view, its lights twinkling against the early morning sky. A new day was dawning, both literally and metaphorically. She glanced at Jameson, who was now gathering his things, preparing for landing. He caught her eye and smiled. "Good luck, Isabella," he said softly, as though sensing the journey she was about to embark on. Isabella felt a lump in her throat, but she smiled back, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning it more than she could express. As the plane touched down, the future felt uncertain. But for the first time, Isabella wasn't afraid of it. She was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that she had the power to shape it, not just for herself, but for the people who mattered most. And as the plane taxied to the gate, Isabella made a decision. She was going to rebuild. She was going to reconnect. She was going to find balance and meaning in her life, not just in her work, but in her relationships, her passions, and her legacy. Because success, she realized, wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey. And hers was just beginning. The first step toward change. The wheels of the plane screeched softly as they made contact with the runway. Isabella felt the familiar sensation of descent, the slight jostle of the aircraft as it slowed to a halt. Usually, this moment was just another step in her routine. Land, disembark, rush to the next meeting, the next client, the next deal. But this time was different. She sat there for a moment longer, letting the weight of everything sink in. The decision she had made up to this point, the years she had spent prioritizing her career over everything else, all seemed distant now, like a life lived by someone else. She had never realized how disconnected she had become from herself, from the things that truly mattered, until this very moment. The cabin lights flickered back on, and the sounds of passengers rustling in their seats filled the air. People gathered their belongings, preparing for the chaos of deplaning. Jameson stretched, yawning slightly as he glanced over at her. "Looks like we've arrived," he said with a smile. "It's been a long flight." Isabella nodded, still caught in her thoughts. She hadn't expected this journey, one that began with annoyance and frustration, to end with such a profound shift in her perspective. She felt as though she had just woken up from a long, exhausting dream, and for the first time, the world around her seemed sharper, clearer. As passengers began filing out of the cabin, Isabella remained seated for a moment longer. She wasn't in a rush. Her usual drive to be the first off the plane, to get to her meetings as quickly as possible, seemed unimportant now. She watched as Jameson stood, gathering his leather folder and small carry-on bag. He looked at her, his eyes still carrying that calm wisdom she had come to admire. "You're going to be all right, you know," he said softly, his tone reassuring. Isabella gave a small, grateful smile. "I hope so." Jameson chuckled. "You don't need to hope. You just need to take action." He paused for a moment, considering his next words. "It's never too late to realign your path. Life's a long journey, and as long as you're open to growth, You'll always find your way." She nodded, appreciating the simplicity of his advice. It wasn't some grand life-changing epiphany. It was practical, actionable. And for someone like Isabella, who had spent her life adhering to plans and strategies, that approach made sense. They stood together, waiting for the line of passengers ahead of them to shuffle forward. Isabella turned to him once more, feeling a strange sense of connection to this man she had barely known a few hours ago. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "I don't think you realize how much our conversation meant to me." Jameson smiled warmly. "I think I do. Sometimes, all it takes is a new perspective to see the possibilities in front of you. I'm just glad I could be part of your journey." With that, they filed into the aisle and made their way toward the exit. As they stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, Isabella felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The burden of constantly chasing the next milestone, the next victory, seemed to lift from her shoulders. The terminal was busy, filled with the usual mix of hurried business travelers and families rushing to catch connecting flights. But Isabella wasn't in a hurry anymore. She walked calmly, her pace slower than usual, savoring the sense of clarity that had settled over her. As they reached the baggage claim area, Jameson turned to her one last time. "This is where we part ways, I guess," he said, extending a hand. "Good luck, Isabella. I have a feeling you're going to do just fine." She took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you, really," she repeated. "Maybe one day I'll be able to return the favor." Jameson grinned. "Who knows? Maybe you will." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd. Isabella stood there for a moment, watching him go, before turning back to her own path. The world seemed different now, full of possibilities, of new directions. She had been given a gift on that flight, one that went far beyond business or networking. She had been given the opportunity to rethink everything, to redefine her life. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her back to reality. She hesitated before pulling it out. Normally, she would have checked it immediately, already thinking of the next task, the next email, the next urgent matter that needed her attention. But now, she was in no rush. She glanced at the screen and saw a string of unread messages from her assistant, her colleagues, and various clients. But one message stood out. It was from Claudia, her sister. The last time they had spoken was nearly a year ago, and it hadn't been on the best of terms. Claudia had tried to reach out, but Isabella had been too caught up in her own world to make time. Seeing her sister's name on the screen brought a wave of emotions that Isabella wasn't prepared for. The message was short, simple. "Hey, I know it's been a while. Just wanted to check in. How are you?" Isabella stared at the message, her heart pounding. She could feel the old version of herself, the one who would have quickly dismissed the message, telling herself she'd respond later, trying to resurface. But this time, she didn't let it. With a deep breath, she typed out a response. "Hey, Claudia. I've missed you. I'm sorry I've been so distant. I'd love to catch up if you're free soon." She hit send before she could overthink it. A sense of relief washed over her, a small but important step toward rebuilding the connection she had let slip away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And that was enough for now. As she made her way toward the exit of the terminal, her mind buzzed with thoughts of the future, of the kind of life she wanted to create, the kind of relationships she wanted to nurture, and the legacy she wanted to leave behind. For so long, she had thought that success was the only thing that mattered. But now she knew better. Success wasn't just about titles or money. It was about the impact you had on the people around you, about living a life that had meaning beyond the walls of an office. Isabella found herself smiling as she stepped out into the crisp morning air. The world felt new again, full of possibilities she hadn't considered before. There was so much she still didn't know, so many questions she didn't have answers to. But that was okay. For the first time, she felt at peace with the uncertainty. She didn't need to have everything figured out right now. As she hailed a taxi to take her to her hotel, she thought of what Jameson had said. It's never too late to realign your path. She was at the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be shaped not by the pursuit of endless achievements, but by a deeper, more meaningful understanding of what truly mattered. Isabella wasn't entirely sure where this path would lead, but she was ready to follow it, wherever it took her. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, Isabella felt a sense of calm settle over her. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't scare her. She had taken the first step toward change, and that was enough. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. And as the city skyline loomed in the distance, bathed in the soft light of morning, Isabella Duncan felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope for the future and a newfound sense of purpose. Her journey was just beginning.